Let's see here. All right. Can you see our front page?
Yep.
All right. And we're ready to go. There's so much we learn from prophecy. And we see that prophecy is not only a word of inspiration that's given in a moment, but prophecy is also something that can be put together in sort of books, gathering prophecies together by subject or by particular burden. And here we see we're right in the middle, beginning in the second book of prophecies that deal with the nations around Judah. We know that we saw the first book having to do with the first 12 chapters, basically had to do with Isaiah seeing the Lord under the throne and then seeing him as Emmanuel and seeing how Emmanuel plays out, especially in their present moment of trial there as they were dealing with Assyria and Assyria's attacks and aggression in the years of King Ahaz. And tonight we're going to specifically look at the very end of Isaiah 14, basically chapter 15 and 16, the prophecies regarding Assyria, Philistia, that's the Philistines, and Moab. You can see by that map, which we've looked at before, that this is a whole series of judgments upon the various nations that surround Judah. And the list of those nations you can see there on the right-hand side. Tonight we deal with Assyria, Philistia, and Moab. And just as a review, as we kind of overview these prophecies as a whole in Book 2, the prophecies mostly begin with this word masa, which means burden or oracle or pronouncement or verdict. But it's something that comes forth in speech that is a statement. So the masa regarding Philistia, the masa regarding Moab, this is so on and so forth. These surrounding nations, the 9 nations surrounding Judah, are judged in relation to Israel as a whole and Judah as a remnant of that whole of Israel. These nations also represent in principle various enemies of God's people and purpose. So these nations are in fact actual national entities, which had certain characteristics, which mean as we look at these Old Testament prophecies, as we know in the Old Testament, we have pictures of what is spiritually given to us and exposited to us in the New Testament. And we will see in the 3 nations that we study tonight that each one of them embraces a certain characteristic that of the enemies of God that we see continually assault not only the Jews in the Old Testament, but also Christians in the New. And then we also will see that almost all of these prophecies, to some degree or another, begin to predict things not only for the present season of Isaiah's life and Hezekiah's life, but also it predicts that conflicts and things will happen at the very end, in the day of Jehovah, with Armageddon and with the coming of the millennial kingdom and all of these things. And so that chart there, we see that Isaiah will be looking over the mountain peaks of revelation given to him. Sometimes, you know how mountains can appear very close when they're actually far away. Sometimes it's a little hard to, probably as he prophesied, to know just what was way in the future and what was in the near future. But that's the very nature of prophecy in its depth. Last time we looked in Isaiah 13 and 14 at Babel's judgment. Babel is Babylon, but in the Bible it's Babel, and it means babbling. It means confusion. And we see there some artist's picture of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the great wonders of the world. But we saw in these 2 chapters the miraculous nature of predictive prophecy. And why do we say that? Because this prediction in Isaiah 13 and 14 of the defeat of Babylon by the Medes was given a few hundred years before the Medes really even came onto the scene. And who would ever suspect that the Medes would defeat Babylon or even that Babylon would come into great prominence and dominate the world. Back in the day of Isaiah's writing, no doubt about it, number one is Syria, number two, Egypt. They were the great empires of the day. But in this moment, and as you see at the beginning of Isaiah's statements in these things, it says, here is the Massa which Isaiah saw. So he is seeing visions, and he is trying to explain these visions in the prophecies as the Lord is speaking to him, as the Holy Spirit moves upon him, according to the scriptures. So it's miraculous. And I say that because that's why scholars, liberal scholars, who really, can I say, greatly de-emphasize the possibility of such miraculous statements and sayings before their time. That's why they have such trouble with a number of portions in Isaiah. Almost all the great books of the Old Testament that really have very important things for us to understand are all hotly contested by liberal scholars who don't see things in miraculous dimensions. But we saw Babylon's judgment, and we saw that the judgment of Jehovah was upon Babel as a type of a one world government that aspires to deity and enslaves people in a captivity, both spiritual and political. And this has gone on through the centuries. You know, I don't know if you realize this, but one of the things that happened to Napoleon as his empire grew and grew and grew is he, knowing what he knew of the scriptures as a Catholic in background, he believed he was the Antichrist. And he was trying to dominate the whole world. He was taking over or reclaiming the Holy Roman Empire, which by the 18th century, when Napoleon was going around, had been pretty much, ended. He was reclaiming this Holy Roman Empire for himself as the Antichrist upon the throne. And he was empowered in a certain way, but he went down because he knew the Antichrist had to fight and have conflict with Jerusalem. And so he went down to Jerusalem and was defeated down there. Anyway, down through history, there have been such men as Nebuchadnezzar, as Tiglath-Pileser, and as the Antichrist in the end, who are desiring to form this one world government. And so when we see these prophecies on Babylon, we can easily sense how they are even being fulfilled with the pictures in Revelations 12 through 19 of the Antichrist and the false prophet and all of these things. But the point was, as we looked at it last time, that we saw that there was a mystery of the conquering power of Babel and of Babel's leaders, and it was satanic in spirit. There was this one, there was this Lucifer, this day star of the morning, who wanted to ascend to the highest, to be as God, to sit in the assembly of the north, to be to take over, really, the Son of God's position in the universe. And this Satan is behind much of the power of the spirits when these single men rise up with this supernatural power to conquer. And so we see, of course, in the prophecy of Isaiah 13 and 14, that Babylon would be absolutely humiliated and brought down. As it says in Revelation, Babylon is fallen, Babylon is fallen, Babylon is fallen. And all the hosts of heaven said, hallelujah, for Babylon the Great has fallen. So this is what we looked at last time. Now tonight, beginning at the very end of chapter 14 and going through chapter 16, we're looking at Jehovah judging the surrounding nations. And tonight's has to do with the oracles, Massa, burdens, against Assyria, Philistia, and Moab. Okay, so let's get right to it. These three nations, as I said before, can teach us things as Old Testament types of enemies of our present spiritual life. So as an example, Assyria, we can learn how the devil 24/7 is accusing us, trying to dominate us, trying to conquer us day and night. So Assyria becomes that conquering threat energized by the spirit of Babel. Because don't forget, Assyria was the first. So Nimrod came to Babylon and tried to build Babylon, and the confusion of language sent him away from Babylon and he went and he established himself in Nineveh, in Ashur. The name of the Assyrians are actually Ashur in the Hebrew. And so he became the first emperor, if you might say, of Assyria. But now the Assyrians are on Judah and Israel attacking, and we have seen all of that with Tiglath-Pileser and Shalmaneser and all of these guys. But it represents the devil constantly attacking us in our lives with this domineering spirit that would oppress. Philistia represents the flesh. We know that the Philistines were uncircumcised. And as David said, what is this man of uncircumcised flesh doing, defying the armies of the living God, as he talked about Goliath? The Philistines always represent this perennial thief of Israel's inheritance and the power of the flesh opposing our lives. And Moab represents the world. That is to say, the world, the sensual, worldly seducers who draw Israel away to idols, as we remember they famously were, even while they were still in the wilderness. Okay, so you see, this is the way we'll try to handle it tonight, to look at these three nations as types. There's much in these passages regarding names of cities and everything within these areas, but that really, it would just be a history or geography lesson, and we want to go a little beyond that. So first we come to the first judgment, and at the end of chapter 14, verse 24 through 27, Assyria judged. And here's the way it opens up. Jehovah of hosts has sworn, saying, surely as I have thought, so it shall come to pass, and as I have purposed, so it shall stand, that I will break the Assyrian in my land. So now this is God saying, I'm going to break Assyria in my land. That is, in Judah is where it's going to happen. The first thing we notice here, and it makes sense, God stands with purpose, especially against their Antichrist conquering pride. Now, all the nations deserve judgments, as we know from Matthew chapter 25. Nations will be judged based on how much they gave a cup of cold water to those in need and things like that. But there are some nations that are actually empowered by Satan himself, and Assyria was one of them. And so God has a special purpose. I will break the Assyrian in my land. Notice verse 27, the last verse of this little section. For the Lord of hosts has purposed, and who will annul it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back? So, of course, Assyria manifested that Nimrodic, domineering, conquering spirit of Babel in Isaiah's lifetime. But Assyria is a type of all pride, really, that God purposely resists and hates. And all that kind of pride that wars to conquer our souls becomes an enemy of the Lord himself. Now, that's really all we have to say about Assyria, because obviously there's been chapters spent on the Assyrian attack and conquest. And Isaiah has already prophesied that they will go up to the neck of Judah and no further, because this is your land, Emmanuel. So we'll leave that. And of course, you all remember that we will find later on in Isaiah that when Sennacherib actually came to try to take over Jerusalem itself, 185,000 of his soldiers were felled in one day by some kind of pestilence in the night. And Assyria went back home to Nineveh and began to decline as an empire from that moment on. So that is Assyria's judgment. It's just a summary statement. Then we come to Philistia. Again, just really a few chapters, but some of these 9 nations, they just really take up a few chapters because they can be summarized. Let's look at this Massa, or oracle of Philistia. So first we ask, who is Philistia? Who are the Philistines? And we find, as we go back into Genesis chapter 10, that actually they're Nimrod's lineage from Ham, one of the 3 sons of Noah, who started out in Africa. But he's of Nimrod's lineage. So they're One doesn't have to wonder long why the Philistines were such bullies, And they were a nation of 5 city-states that settled along the very coast of Canaan. They were merchants to a certain degree on the sea. And you can see there Ekron, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, and Raphia, and also Gath, as you can see. But the Raphia was a later, this map is a little later history. Anyway, these were city-states. And, that's the way most empires were. The Philistine people were Ekronites or Ashdodites or Gathites. Goliath was a Gathite, Gittite, and a Gazite, and so on and so forth. So they were city-states. The land of Goliath, of course, was part of the Philistines, and Samson's capture was in Gaza by the Philistines. But they were the perennial thief of Judah's inheritance whenever Israel became weak and divided. So you remember when the 12 tribes came into the land, and then they would get divided and become weak because of idolatry. Every time the Philistines had a chance, they would take over land. They were stealth. They were like foxes. It's not like they were so strong that they could just go and conquer, but they would, of course, they had iron chariots, which made them very powerful, but they would go in weakness. They had to have a pocket of weakness to really get in there, right? Now, as to the actual burden in itself, it begins, as it says in verse 28, the Massa came to Isaiah in the year that King Ahaz died. And verse 29 says this: do not rejoice, Philistia, all of you, because the rod that struck you is broken. For from the serpent's root a viper will come out, and its fruit will be a winged serpent. Now, this verse 29, the scholars are pretty evenly divided, but it could be either way. Either this means the broken rod was King Ahaz who died, and now the Philistia says, now we're free from their yoke. But now a flying serpent out of that broken rod would turn into a snake, and out of that snake, a flying serpent being Hezekiah, a much stronger king who would greatly subdue the Philistines again in the land of Judah. Or it could be that the broken rod was Tiglath-Pileser, who died in the same year as King Ahaz, and perhaps they felt relief now from the tyranny of Assyria, but this prophecy is saying that Sennacherib would rise as that winged serpent. So either way, what it means at Philistia, here's the burden. You have been set free for a moment, but you will come under a greater bondage for your sins. So in verse 31, the verse says, wail and cry, because my anointed from the north is coming to judge your evil pride. Notice that, wail, you gate, cry, you city, melt away, Philistia, all of you, for smoke comes from the north. There's no straggler in the ranks. It's that statement, smoke comes from the north, that has some of those scholars who believe it would be the Assyrians and Sennacherib who would be coming. And then verse 32, the reason Philistia would be decimated is that they have opposed God, who has founded Zion as a refuge for all the poor and helpless. Look at verse 32. What answer will one give the messengers of the nation? That the Lord has founded Zion, and that the poor of his people will take refuge in it. Now, so there's the Philistines, the bullies. They crush those who are weak. And yet the Lord has founded Zion, and they must be judged because they have stood against Zion as opponents of Zion, as always trying to attack Zion from the days of King Saul right through David and afterwards. So when we look at this oracle of Philistia, and some, as we see it as a type of uncircumcised flesh, it is our flesh that steals our inheritance. Now, often we say, the devil has stolen my blessing or something like that. But it's actually our own flesh that often steals our spiritual blessing. A perennial enemy that lives right on our border within is the flesh, the Philistines. They live right over the hill. As soon as you get weak, here they come over the hill. Flesh is also religious flesh, which serves without the cross. The Philistines were those who came into Canaan but not through way of the sea, that is through way of the baptism or the cross, but they snuck in over and around the top. And the religious flesh, which serves without the cross, would be perfectly exemplified, if you will remember, in King Saul, who even offered sacrifices in the flesh to try to serve God. So there's flesh. 3, it's the invader who tries to gain Canaan the easy way, as I've already stated. 4, they're the boasting giants of flesh that create fear and paralysis. I'm going to tear your heads off. I'm going to destroy Israel, so Goliath would say, until David stood against him. So of course, the whole reason that Philistia is now going to be judged is that the Lord has founded Zion for the humble, and only the humble and the poor can live under the blessing of Zion. So Philistia, out of the land in your pride. So of course, practically we see that the footnote, what is the remedy for defeating the flesh? First, separation, the cross and separation from that which is fleshly. And second of all, kingship, because you'll remember in the book of Judges, there was no king in those days. And that gave occasion for the Philistines continually to prevail over Israel, because the flesh prevails when we are weak, unless we have a king in the center of our lives. And then the Philistines can't win. So just a little spiritual lesson through that Massa to Philistia. But now chapters 15 and 16, although they're brief chapters, they're dealing with Moab. And this is the main lesson for us to learn. There's one important lesson regarding judgment for us to learn tonight through Moab's judgment. And so let's get right to it and see what's going on here. This is a picture, if you'll recall, when the children of Israel went through the wilderness, Balak, who was a king of Moab, called Balaam and paid Balaam, the prophet, to curse Israel. Balaam looked out over the children of Israel sojourning through the wilderness and blessed them instead of cursed them. And you'll remember that story. But then Balaam came up with a plan, and he had the temple prostitutes from the temple of Baal Peor come out, because the Moabite people were very sexual, very sensual, and they loved these feasts with temple prostitutes, these orgies, really, in the name of religion. And as you'll remember, the men of Israel were enticed to worship this idol of Baal Peor, and 24,000, I believe it was, were judged and killed by the Levites because of the unfaithfulness of their falling into this kind of idolatry. So right from the beginning, God cursed the Moabites and said, nobody shall marry a Moabite, remember, and all of this kind of thing, because they have such a seductive influence. Once you meet a Moabite, if you hang out with them too long, you fall in love with them, become seduced by them, and things go badly wrong. Now, who is Moab as a people? Interesting. Moab are Abraham's problematic relatives through Lot. Lot, of course, left Abraham, went down to Sodom. And when Lot had to leave Sodom and Gomorrah, he took his wife and his 2 daughters. His wife turned into a pillar of salt, and his 2 daughters lay with him. And the older daughter lay with him, and the child that conceived was Moab. Moab means from Ab, from the father. So that's Moab's name. Moab is known as people from the father, from their father, from, Lot. Number 2, Balaam sent the voluptuous temple prostitutes of Baal Peor to seduce the men of Israel in the wilderness. This is their history, right? This is the territory of land. If you look at that map, as best as you can see, the Moab's kind of in the gold. Moab was stuck in between the Edomites to the south, which were who? The relatives born of Esau, and the Ammonites on the north. Here later, they're the Amorites, but the Ammonites, and who are they? That was the other daughter of Lot's son, Ammon. So they're stuck So here, this is an area here of our relations, Israel's relations. So even at the point where the children of Israel came in to take over the land, Reuben and Gad came in and possessed Moab, their land. But they intermarried, they were seduced to follow their gods, and at times were ruled over by Moabite kings. If you'll remember in Judges, King Eglon, the big fat guy that they stuck a knife into his belly and all that, he was the king of Moab who had brought the Gad and Reuben under his oppression. And fourth, so they recommend they were a very worldly, very wealthy, prosperous, decadent nation whose spoiled, sensual lives come from their worship of Chemosh, the abomination of Moab. Now, in 1 Kings 11:7, it talks about when Solomon built a temple to Chemosh up on Mount Olivet. He married, in his old age, he became just, a silly, sexual, unfaithful. I don't know how you say you're unfaithful when you got 300 wives or whatever he had, but he was just running around. And he married a Moabite princess and set up a temple of Chemosh. But it was called the abomination of Moab. And some of the indication is, according to Jewish tradition, that this abominable practices there included homosexuality as a common practice in Moab. So Moab was a very, a very corrupt and sensual country. This here in the green, you just to see where now Moab is now today's Jordan. And if you look there, you'll see Amman, the capital of Jordan, and etc. Just to let you know geographically where that's at. And Moab in history, Israelites were forbidden to marry the Moabites because of their history of seducing Israel. In 580 BC, of course, that's not quite 200 years after Isaiah prophesied, Babylon carried off the final remnant of Moab, and it ended completely as a nation and just became a wasteland, a desert wasteland. Most of Moab was desert wasteland, but boy, their rivers produced luscious crops and everything. But most of it was a huge wilderness after that. The deserted land was eventually populated by Bedouin shepherds. And if you'll know the king of Jordan, King Hussein, they were Bedouins by today's king of Jordan. And the Romans built the Decapolis, which is mentioned in the Gospels, that are 10 cities in Moab, including Pella, which became famous as a Christian city of refuge. Well, so much for the background. But Moab is a type. And as you can see and imagine from the type, here it is. They're a type of worldly relatives. That is to say, those who continually seduce us, those who are related to us, those who are half sisters, half brothers, half Christians, all that kind of stuff. 1 Kings 11:7, of course, they were related to Abraham through Lot, who chose to live in worldly Sodom. The land of Reuben and Gad on the wrong side of the Jordan. Reuben and Gad, when they took that land, it actually wasn't part of Canaan land. It wasn't part of the promised land. It was to the east of the promised land. So you get the understanding, here's some of the God's covenant kids, but they're not living in the land of promise, in the land of rest. They're on the wrong side of the river, if you want to put it that way. 3, they were also David's relatives, because through Ruth, the Moabitess, the grandmother of David, and you'll remember when David was being sought out by King Saul, he actually took his family, including his mom and dad and everything, over to live safely among the Moabites. So there's a relationship through David and his family, which means there's a relationship between Isaiah and the Moabites, because he's part of royalty, as was Uzziah and Hezekiah. They're all from David's family. So there's a connection, and maybe a strained connection, we would say, with the Moabites. Number 4, Solomon in his old age seduced into building Chemosh, a temple for pleasure on Mount Olivet. Imagine that, right across from the great temple and everything that he built. Silly old man, just seduced by in his womanizing. Number 5, their beautiful art. Now, these were artistic culture. They listened to classical music. They had art museums, all that kind of stuff. Their food and their culture and their worldliness always tempted God's chosen to cross the Jordan and pursue pleasure. This was the pleasure zone. This is, and whatever goes to Las Vegas will stay in Jordan or in Moab. This is the place where all of that decadence is seen. And that vanity and liberalism and excessive pride of life, this will be the reason for their judgment, marked their culture and made them weak as a nation and vulnerable to attack. Frankly, they didn't have an army they had an army that fell apart as soon as they were attacked, because they just were geared toward anything, any heavy loading, anything that involved real responsibility and discipline. Of course, Moab is a type of the leaven of civilization. Now, of course, classical music is great, isn't it? Civilization is great. The arts are great. It's all great. But there's a hook in all things in the world that can seduce us and take us away from our primary purpose. All great things and beautiful things and great foods and all this are given to us to enjoy, but they can seduce us away from the very life and purpose of God. And that's why Moab is this kind of type of a worldly relative who's always causing us trouble for one reason or another. Well, now we get into the actual lament. And there's not too much to say about these things. This is the verdict, the Massa against Moab. Here, it translated better verdict rather than pronouncement or burden or oracle. Because in the night, Ar of Moab is laid waste and destroyed. Because in the night, Kir of Moab is laid waste and destroyed. Here's the burden, the verdict. There'll be a sudden disaster that will come in one night and devastate Moab. And the people, it goes on to say in verses 2 and 3, the people will weep and wail, make vows in vain across the land. They'll run into the temple of Chemosh. They'll run into the stronghold of Dibon. They'll cut off their beards and their hair and wear sackcloth. They'll weep and try to do penance on the housetops in the streets, because they're such refined people and they can't believe that they're being absolutely destroyed. And they have nothing else to do except just weep and cry and sob. But it's too late. All their sins in the night have made even her soldiers weak, vulnerable, and ripe for judgment. You notice there it says at the end of verse 4, therefore the armed soldiers of Moab will cry out. His life will be burdensome to him. And then here's the interesting thing. Now in verse 5, we'll find, and beyond, Isaiah begins to weep and lament for Moab's devastation. And so a lament begins. My heart will cry out for Moab, Isaiah says. He sees their pitiful condition, their desperate situation. They're refugees. They just look like these tragic pictures we're seeing in Ukraine and in the very news this day of refugees confused and not knowing where to go and desperate and crying in the street. He says in verse 15:5, his fugitives shall flee to Zoar. Zoar is where Lot and his daughters, had relations up in the mountains after escaping from Sodom. They couldn't get the world out of them. And anyway, they're trying to escape back to their roots. They're hiding away from destruction, which will do them no good. The rivers have dried. All of their rich produce has gone bad. And they're just devastated. They don't know how to fight. They just are weeping. They're pitiful, pitiful people. That's chapter 15, as you can see very quickly. Then chapter 16, Isaiah offers counsel from the Lord for the people of Moab. 3 prophetic counsels are given Moab if they would repent. Number 1, verse 16, chapter 16, verse 1. Isn't this interesting? Offer up a lamb in Zion. I'll have to explain. He says, send the lamb to the ruler of the land, from Selah to the wilderness, to the mount of the daughter of Zion. Now, what happened was in David's day, they would have to offer tribute of lambs. Actually, it was 100,000 lambs. But Moab was so rich that this was nothing for them. But when they were under as a vassal of Israel under David's throne in Zion, they knew peace and protection. They could get about their business and enjoy life. It's when they were under Zion that they actually thrived, even when they sent in that tribute. So offer up a lamb in Zion. It makes you think of course, something more about the Lamb of God, doesn't it? And then number 2 in Isaiah 16:3, the exhortation, second counsel is, do what is righteous, hide all poor and outcasts during the devastation. There it is in verse 3 and 4 in part. Take counsel, execute judgment, make your shadow like the night in the middle of the day. Hide the outcasts. Do not betray him who escapes. Let my outcast dwell with you, O Moab. Now, it's very interesting. In the end, Moab will be restored. And part of the reason will be that Moab is the one who offers refuge to the Jews when the Romans came in and when the Babylonians came in. The only place of refuge they found was in the rocks, in the caverns, and the places in Moab, including Pella for the Christians, and Petra, and such places as that. So they're exhorted to do what is right. Stop being so proud and haughty and above all of the people, and help the poor in this time, because during this time, the Assyrian conquest, there was all kinds of refugees, including refugees from Judah, and of course Israel. Northern Israel was being absolutely sacked and destroyed. The tribes of these two tribes that were part of Moab were being taken away, and some were finding refuge. And that was the second counsel. And the third counsel in 16:5 is to hope in the establishment of Zion's righteous throne. So all of this terrible trauma and your own devastation, put your hope in this promise. Verse 5, in mercy the throne will be established, and one will sit on it in truth, in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking justice and hastening righteousness. So pray, hope for the return of that righteous king and judge, even David, from his throne. This was the counsel that was given in these first 5 verses. But listen to verse 6. We have heard of the pride of Moab. He is very proud. Of his haughtiness and his pride and his wrath. His idle boasts are false. And God must judge Moab for its utter pride and haughtiness. So Moab would be too proud to accept Jehovah's mercy, to offer a lamb in Judah. Moab's boasting of worldly wealth will be overturned by poverty. And when you're rich and everything is lost, you've got nothing. You got nothing. Their fertile fields of Heshbon shall lay fallow. The vines of Sibnah, yielding the best wines, will be missed. The Moabites produced the best wine in the whole area. Their vineyards up there by the river Arn were just so great, so above all, that we'll see Isaiah even cries because they'll no longer have any of this wine that comes from Moab. Moab was a lush place, but her pride has completely done her in. In verses 9 through 12, it goes on. God's judgment of Moab, humbling and pitiful. Listen to Isaiah again as he weeps in pity for Moab. Therefore, I will bewail the vine of Sibnah, that's the wine from there. With the weeping of Jazar, I will drench you with my tears. Moab's joy and shouting for her wine. So Moab had a fall festival, like the Feast of Tabernacles. They had a fall festival. It was a wine festival. It was a harvest festival. And it was a place where you wanted to go if you wanted to have a great time. All of that is destroyed. All of that produce is fallow. All of the vineyards are destroyed by the destroyer. And in Isaiah's heart, which literally is in his bowels, he plays a lament upon his harp as Moab's prayers and sacrifices go unanswered. Just listen to this, verses 11 and 12 here. Therefore, my inner being, that's my bowels, the same word as in the New Testament, the deepest guts of my life. Therefore, my guts sound like a harp for Moab, and my heart for Kir Harosheth. So it will come about when Moab presents himself, when he tries himself upon his high places and goes to Chemosh and goes to Baal Peor, comes to his sanctuary to pray, that he will not prevail. And finally, the last two verses of this chapter. Jehovah's judgment on Moab's pride will be swift. This is the word which the Lord spoke earlier concerning Moab. But now the Lord has spoken, saying, within 3 years, as a hired worker would count them, the glory of Moab will become contemptible, along with all his great population, and his remnant will be very small and impotent. Now you see that verse 13, that this is the word which the Lord spoke earlier. This is indeed a word that was spoken back in Numbers 21, verses 27 through 30, where Moab was already condemned for her pride and haughtiness. And that was back in the days of the wilderness wandering. But now within 3 years, and within 3 years it happened, Moab was completely destroyed and cut down by the Assyrians. They had glory, but it had been abased. All of the things they could show off had been destroyed. All they had was remorse, brokenheartedness, pity, etc. Now in this lesson of the Massa of Moab, I think there's one particular lesson that is worth us noting and learning from this. Here it is. God's heart in judgment. You see Isaiah weeps for Moab several times, even as he prophesies judgment. Isaiah is revealing God's heart of pity, even when judgments are pronounced. When God does judgment and when he brings judgment, we would think he's just some kind of hard as nails, hard, tough guy. But God does not will, according to the scriptures, that any of the nations should perish, but that they should repent and live humbly before their God. So number 4, Moab represents the spiritual condition of two groups for us, as well as for Judah. One, our proud and unbelieving relatives who've been deceived by this world and headed towards certain judgment. Oh, they're so proud in their accomplishments and in their wealth and in their culture and all of these things. But that pride will be abased. Or secondly, as I'm saying, our Christian relatives, that is, the tribes of Gad and Reuben, so intermarried with the Moabites that it was hard to tell them apart. They were Christians, yes. They were Jews, they were tribes, but, were they covenant people? They've intermarried with the world, and perhaps they're not even really saved. God has a heart for these people. They're deceived. Their pride has deceived them. They think they're all right. They think there's no problem. And Isaiah's weeping represents, I think, God's heart. So, number 5, Isaiah weeps and intercedes because these professing believers are deceived and most to be pitied when judgment comes. There's the out and out Assyrian, worldly, godless man. But these are semi-religious. everything culturally religious, and they're most to be pitied. And then finally, just a footnote there, number 6, in the end, the remnant of Moab will be saved and offer refuge to Israel in the day of Jacob's trouble. And we needn't go into it. I see my time's up already. But in Jeremiah 48, it says, and Moab in the end will be saved after much trouble. Daniel chapter 11, verse 41, talks about the time when the Jews have to flood into to their east because the Antichrist comes down in his final attacks, and he gives refuge to believers. And in Revelations 12, where the woman in heaven gives birth to her children, and they have to run through the wilderness for 3.5 years. This is speaking of Moab, where these children will be kept from the enemy's attack, and so on and so forth. So in the end, Moab is restored. There's enough relationship there that the Lord redeems them, and they're not completely destroyed. Well, here we are, this story, the Massa, the stories of Assyria, of Philistia, and of Moab. Just a couple of questions. Maybe we could spend a few minutes if anybody wants to comment before we turn off for the night. Here we go. Number 1, why would Isaiah prophesy to the nations, since his burden is for Judah and Jehovah's children? Why all this about the nations? Chapter 13 through 23. Why? Number 2, what do we learn about God through his dealings with Babel, Philistia, and Moab? This is almost a part of it. How does Isaiah's taunt over Babel different from his lament over Moab? And how does this reflect the heart of Jehovah? You see that is actual a taunt that is given in Isaiah 14 that we studied last week. But now it's a lament over Moab. Or question number 4, taking the types of the 3 countries, Moab being the world, Philistia the flesh, and Babel the devil, which one threatens our country the most? So